Hi, and welcome to Vera Voices. I'm Michael Jacobson, Vera's director. We're here today with Don Stemen, one of the senior researchers on our Anatomy of Discretion project, which is a National Institute of Justice funded project that looks at the use of prosecutorial discretion in a couple of prosecutors' agencies around the country. Tell us a bit about what you did, sort of the methodology of how you studied prosecutorial discretion, and maybe list a few of the major findings.
We set out to try to understand really how prosecutors make decisions in cases, and we wanted, one, to try to understand what factors influence prosecutorial decision making at different stages of the process, from screening through charging, through plea offer and final sentence recommendation. We also wanted to understand not only what factors influenced decision-making, but how prosecutors weighed those factors, how they interpreted them throughout the case. And we wanted to understand what kind of external factors influence prosecutorial decision-making. So things, informal and formal mechanisms, perhaps either inside the prosecutor's office or outside, contextual factors that influence decision-making throughout a case. So we did that by talking to prosecutors in two jurisdictions in the United States, two county prosecutors' offices, one in the Southeast and one in the Midwest. And the approach we took was to look at it from several different angles. We looked at administrative data on cases, to look at outcomes of the cases through administrative case files. We did an attitudinal survey of prosecutors, asking them opinions about how they view their job, about how they interpret their own success, about how they interpret the office's success, what goals they see of the prosecution process of the criminal justice system more generally. And we did a series of focus groups and interviews with prosecutors to try to provide more context to their answers in those attitudinal surveys, to try to get at the meat of how they weigh the factors that they talked about. And finally, we asked them to make decisions in a series of hypothetical cases, so we could look across the office and see how different prosecutors were making decisions about the same case. And what we found were three things that we think are important. One, we found that evidence matters a great deal. It matters a great deal, particularly at the initial screening decision. Prosecutors throughout the life of a case ask two questions. Can I prove this case, and should I prove this case? And that first question of can I prove this case is the primary question they ask at screening. And to answer that question, they rely heavily on evidence, almost entirely on evidence, and the strength of the evidence. As the case progresses throughout it, we find that while evidence continues to matter, it starts to matter less, and other factors start to influence their decision making, and they shift to the second question of should I prove this case? And in answering that question throughout the case, a lot of different factors come in, primarily severity of the offense, defendant criminal history, but other factors start to matter too, other aspects of the defendant, other aspects of the case. And what we found most important perhaps was that there were contextual factors that mattered, things outside the case that also started to affect it. One of the primary ones was resources. And when we went in, we thought that it would be resources internal to the prosecutor's office. Caseloads, support staff, access to investigators. But what we found, it was resources outside the prosecutor's office, particularly in the judiciary, in that the availability of courtrooms to hear cases, the number of judges that were available, the number of days every week that the courtroom was open, the lack of those required prosecutors to reevaluate cases because they couldn't possibly try everything that was coming through. So it led prosecutors to shift resources within their own office. In the Midwestern County Prosecutor's Office, they shifted them to the very beginning of the process, putting more resources into screening to try to funnel more cases out of the system. In the Southeast, they reevaluated cases as units. So when cases couldn't be tried, they came back, and together as groups, they reevaluated cases to determine which were the strongest cases, which cases could receive a different plea bargain perhaps to try to expedite the process, which cases perhaps had to be dismissed. We also found that outcomes varied a lot by prosecutor, so that the prosecutor mattered a great deal in determining the outcome of a case. So we found that across the offices there was a lot of variation across prosecutors and what they saw as the goals of the criminal justice system. How they interpreted justice and fairness were different, and whether fairness meant consistency in outcomes or whether fairness meant consistency in process or how they weighed factors or how they viewed factors, not necessarily the same outcome but the same evaluation of the case.
Let me ask you a little about this interplay between the sort of notion of evidence and the strength of the evidence, which is sort of intuitive. I think people understand what that means, and this notion of justice. What did justice mean for those prosecutors?
Right. Both offices had a very clear philosophy that was communicated by the district attorneys in both places, that prosecutors were to do justice, to do the right thing. That was the extent of the direction that was given from above. But prosecutors saw that as a very powerful philosophy, as one that guided their decision making. They didn't see the decision making as unguided. It was clearly guided by the sense of justice. But that sense of justice was allowed to vary across the office. We didn't get a clear definition of what justice meant. Sometimes justice meant for some people consistency in outcomes, that everyone would see similar outcomes for the same offense. And moreover, there were a large group of people who thought consistency was a very, very important piece of the process. Others interpreted justice as individualized treatment, so that each individual defendant was assessed on their own. So how this would affect, how an outcome, a particular outcome would affect this defendant, and whether this was the right outcome for this defendant. So justice was allowed to vary in the office between these two extremes. One, a sense of justice meaning equality or equitable treatment in outcome, and the other meaning individualized treatment, individualized outcome.
Right, it's really interesting. So even with a strong sense of justice, and I suppose that's it's not a concept you can easily wrap your hands around in any concrete way, there were still obviously, both within those offices and I assume between those offices, pretty big differences in the use of discretion.
There were different outcomes across prosecutors, so that one prosecutor may decline 10% of cases, while a different prosecutor looking at similar cases may decline 25% of them. And we saw that across the office. I don't know that it led to disparate outcomes in a sense that there was any one particular characteristic of a case or defendant that would predict a disparate outcome. I think what it led to were very different views of how discretion should be exercised. Prosecutors in both offices understood they had a great deal of discretion. They understood they were wielding a great deal of power. What's interesting is that while we may see a different interpretation of justice, the sense of justice really did define what they did. And I'll say this, I think in the end, their interpretation of justice was very defendant focused, that it was fair treatment for the defendant. That fair treatment was allowed to vary, though, whether fair treatment went equitable outcome or whether fair treatment went individualized outcome.
Given all that, and I know there are a number of policy recommendations that you folks have in the report, but maybe you could go over the top 2 or 3 that stem from your findings.
Yeah, I think more than recommendations, I think we have a few policy implications that come out of this. One is this finding that we have that while evidence matters throughout a case, its importance decreases over time as other factors become more important. I think one policy implication of this is for us to determine which of those factors are we comfortable with influencing a case, and how can the prosecutor's office control which factors matter. 2, I think this matter of outside influences and how they affect cases, particularly resources, outside the prosecutor's office and how they affect distribution of resources within the office, raises questions about whether we think that's getting us the outcomes we want, particularly as trial rates continue to decline. When we find out that the decrease in availability of courtrooms is actually changing the way prosecutors view cases, we should think about whether that's the right outcome that we want. And 3, the matter of consistency across prosecutors is one we should think about, and what are we hoping for in consistency? Do we want consistent treatment, or do we want consistent outcomes, and how important are both of those for the prosecution justice?
And is there a natural sort of second phase of this work?
There are a lot of research questions that weren't answered, and I think getting more deeply into these contextual factors and how they affect cases, I think, is important, and trying to understand the relationships between, say, law enforcement, who are the providers of evidence, and the prosecutor's office, who then interpret and use it, I think are important places for us to continue to examine prosecutorial decision making.
Well, thank you. It's fascinating, and I think the value of this research is not just in the particular findings, but in that prosecutors' offices let you and the other research folks have almost complete access to their data to study something that has not really been studied with any great specificity in the United States. It's really important, and thank you for coming.
Great, thanks so much.